Some words cut so deep they become the foundation of who you become. For Tom Brady, those words came from the one person who was supposed to believe in him most, his childhood coach. What started as a crushing blow to a 12-year-old's dreams would become the fuel that powered one of the greatest comebacks in sports history. But the real story isn't about revenge or proving someone wrong. It's about forgiveness, the power of doubt to create determination, and a promise made in a hospital room that would change two lives forever. The morning mist hung over Portola Valley as Tom Brady pulled his Tesla into the parking lot of San Mateo Youth Football Complex. 25 years had passed since he'd last set foot on these fields, but the memories came flooding back like it was yesterday. The smell of fresh-cut grass, the sound of cleats on concrete, the nervous energy of kids chasing their NFL dreams. He wasn't supposed to be here. His publicist had specifically told him to avoid anything that might stir up old controversies, especially now that he was retired and focused on his broadcasting career. But some calls you can't ignore, and when the hospital had reached out about Coach Morrison's condition, Tom knew he had to come. Walking across the field, Tom could almost see his 12-year-old self running sprints, throwing passes to receivers who barely came up to his shoulder. Back then, he was just Tommy Brady, the tall, skinny kid who showed up early and stayed late, the one who asked too many questions and never seemed to quite fit in with the other boys. "You're wasting everyone's time, Brady." The words echoed in his mind as clearly as if Coach Morrison had just spoken them. Tom stopped walking and closed his eyes, transported back to that devastating day in 1989 when his world had crumbled with just 8 words. It had been the final practice before team selections. Tom had been working on his footwork, trying to perfect the 3-step drop that Coach Morrison demanded from his quarterbacks. The other boys were bigger, stronger, more naturally gifted, but Tom made up for it with preparation and pure determination. "Morrison!" Tom had called out, his voice cracking with preteen uncertainty. "Can you check my form on this play?" Coach Morrison had looked up from his clipboard, his weathered face showing the irritation that had become all too familiar. At 45, he was a former college player whose own dreams had been cut short by injury, and sometimes that bitterness leaked into his coaching. "Brady, come here," Morrison had said, his voice carrying across the field. The other boys stopped what they were doing, sensing something was about to happen. Tom had jogged over eagerly, his cleats clicking against the concrete, still believing that hard work and dedication could overcome any obstacle. He'd practiced that 3-step drop 1,000 times in his backyard, visualizing himself leading the team to victory. "You see this?" Morrison had held up his roster, making sure the other boys could hear. 12 spots. 12 kids who have what it takes to represent this program. Tom had nodded, his heart racing with anticipation. "You're not one of them, Brady. You're slow, you're weak, and you don't have the arm strength to compete at this level." Morrison's voice had been matter-of-fact, clinical even. "You're wasting everyone's time here, including your own. Maybe you should think about trying out for the debate team instead." The silence that followed had been deafening. 24 boys had stood frozen, watching as Tom's face crumbled. Some had looked away in embarrassment, others had smirked, but all of them had witnessed the moment when a kid's dreams were publicly executed. Tom had stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Finally, he'd managed to whisper, "Yes, sir," before turning and walking off the field, his cleats now sounding like thunder in the awful silence. He'd made it to his mom's car before the tears came. Now, standing on that same field as a 7-time Super Bowl champion, Tom could still feel the sting of that humiliation. But something else had grown from that pain. A determination so fierce it had carried him through 23 years of professional football. His phone buzzed. A text from the hospital. "Mr. Brady, Coach Morrison is asking for you. Room 314. Tom took one last look at the field where his legend had been born from the ashes of rejection, then headed for his car. It was time to face the man whose words had shaped his entire life. San Francisco General Hospital smelled exactly like Tom remembered hospitals smelling, antiseptic mixed with fear and hope. He'd visited enough teammates here over the years, but this felt different. This was personal in a way that made his chest tight. Room 314 was at the end of a long hallway lined with generic artwork and motivational posters. Tom paused outside the door, his hand on the handle, wondering what he would say to the man who had crushed his childhood dreams and, inadvertently, created his adult success. The knock was soft, almost hesitant. "Come in," came a voice from inside. Weaker than Tom remembered, but unmistakably Coach Morrison. Tom pushed open the door and stepped into the room. The man in the hospital bed was barely recognizable as the imposing figure who had once commanded the respect and fear of dozens of young athletes. Cancer had stolen his bulk, leaving behind a frail shell connected to monitors and 4 drips. But his eyes, those sharp, critical eyes that had seen through every excuse and called out every mistake, those were exactly the same. "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tom Brady came to see me." Tom approached the bed slowly, noting how Morrison's hands shook slightly as he tried to sit up straighter. "Hello, Coach. How are you feeling?" Morrison's laugh turned into a cough. "Like I'm dying, which the doctors tell me I am." He studied Tom's face with those penetrating eyes. "You look good, Brady. Success suits you." An awkward silence filled the room. Tom had imagined this conversation 1,000 times over the years. Sometimes it was him gloating over his achievements. Sometimes it was him demanding an apology. Sometimes it was him walking away without saying a word. But now, faced with this dying man, all those imagined scenarios seemed petty and meaningless. "I heard about your diagnosis," Tom said finally. "I wanted to come see you, to gloat." Morrison's eyes held a spark of their old fire. "Can't say I'd blame you. I wasn't exactly kind to you back then." Tom pulled up the room's single visitor chair and sat down. "No, not to gloat. To thank you." Morrison's eyebrows rose. "Thank me? For what?" "For giving me something to prove." Tom's voice was steady, but his hands were clasped tightly in his lap. "Those words you said to me that day, about me wasting everyone's time, they became my fuel. Every practice, every game, every season, I heard your voice telling me I wasn't good enough." Morrison stared at him for a long moment. "And that helped you?" "It saved me," Tom said simply. "Do you know how many times I wanted to quit? High school, college, the NFL. There were moments when everything seemed impossible, but I'd remember that day on the field, remember how it felt to be told I wasn't good enough, and I'd find a way to keep going." Morrison's expression was unreadable. "So you're saying I did you a favor by crushing a 12-year-old's dreams?" Tom considered the question carefully. "I'm saying that your words, as harsh as they were, taught me that other people's opinions of me didn't define my limits. Only I could do that. But at what cost?" Morrison's voice was barely audible now. "I've thought about that day every year since. Wondered what might have been different if I'd encouraged you instead of tearing you down." Tom leaned forward. "Coach, can I tell you something? That wasn't the only time someone told me I wasn't good enough. NFL scouts said I was too slow. Coaches said I didn't have the arm strength. Draft analysts said I'd never succeed at the professional level. But by then, I'd learned to use doubt as motivation instead of letting it defeat me. You taught me that." Morrison closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. "I was angry back then, Brady. Angry at the world. Angry at my own failed dreams. I took it out on kids who just wanted to play football. That's not coaching. That's cruelty." "Maybe," Tom said, "but it's also the reason I never gave up on myself. Even when I was drafted 199th, even when I was 4th on the depth chart my rookie year, I knew I belonged because I'd already survived the worst thing anyone could say to me. Morrison struggled to sit up higher in his bed. There's something you don't know about that day, Brady. Something I've never told anyone. Tom waited. After you left the field, after you walked to your mother's car with your head down, I watched you through my office window. You sat in that car for maybe 10 minutes, and I could see you crying. But then you got out, walked to the fence, and stood there watching the other boys practice for another hour. Tom remembered that day differently. In his memory, he'd gone straight home and hidden in his room. You had this look on your face, Morrison continued. Not defeat, not anger, determination. That's when I knew I'd made a mistake. You weren't just another kid who couldn't handle criticism. You were different. But by then, the damage was done. The damage made me stronger, Tom insisted. Morrison shook his head weakly. No, Brady. You made yourself stronger despite the damage. There's a difference. He paused, gathering his breath. I've coached hundreds of kids over 40 years. Some were more talented than you. Some worked just as hard. But none of them had what you had. The ability to transform pain into purpose. Tom felt something shift inside him. A weight he'd carried for decades beginning to lift. Coach, I need you to know something. I forgive you. For that day, for those words, for everything. You were dealing with your own pain, and I understand that now. Morrison's tears flowed freely now. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't about what you deserve, Tom said gently. It's about what I need to let go of. And I'm ready to let go of the anger I've carried since I was 12 years old. Morrison reached out with a trembling hand, and Tom took it. I'm proud of you, Brady. Not just for what you accomplished on the field, but for the man you became despite having coaches like me. They sat in silence for several minutes. Two men separated by decades, but connected by a moment that had shaped both their lives in unexpected ways. Can I ask you something? Morrison said finally. Of course. Do you think things would have been different if I'd encouraged you that day instead of cutting you down? Tom thought about it seriously. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe I wouldn't have developed that edge, that need to prove myself. Maybe I would have been content with being good enough instead of demanding greatness from myself. Morrison nodded slowly. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to us becomes the best thing, doesn't it? Sometimes, Tom agreed. But that doesn't make it right. Kids deserve coaches who believe in them, who help them find their potential instead of crushing their spirits. Is that why you started your youth foundation? Morrison asked. To be the kind of coach I should have been? Tom smiled for the first time since entering the room. Partly, yes. Every kid who comes through our programs hears the same message. Your past doesn't determine your future, and other people's limitations don't apply to you. Morrison squeezed Tom's hand weakly. That's beautiful, Brady. That's coaching. A nurse came in to check Morrison's vitals, and Tom stood to leave. But as he reached the door, Morrison called out to him. Brady. Tom turned back. Thank you for coming, and thank you for proving me wrong in the most spectacular way possible. Tom smiled. Thank you for giving me something to prove. As Tom walked back through the hospital corridors, he felt lighter than he had in years. The angry 12-year-old boy who had been carrying Coach Morrison's words like a stone in his chest was finally at peace. But the story didn't end there. Over the next 3 months, Tom visited Morrison regularly. They talked about football, about life, about the kids they both coached in different ways. Morrison shared stories of other players he'd encouraged, moments when his coaching had lifted someone up instead of tearing them down. Tom arranged for Morrison to speak to kids at his foundation, not about his mistakes, but about what he'd learned from them. Morrison's message was simple but powerful. Words have consequences, and the way we treat people in their most vulnerable moments can shape the rest of their lives. When Morrison passed away peacefully on a Tuesday morning in March, Tom was there, holding his hand. The last words Morrison spoke were, "Tell the kids to be better than I was." At the funeral, Tom delivered the eulogy. He spoke not about Morrison's failures as a coach, but about his final months as a teacher. He talked about redemption, about how it's never too late to acknowledge our mistakes and try to make things right. "Coach Morrison taught me two of the most important lessons of my life," Tom said to the gathered crowd. First, that the opinions of others don't define our potential. Only our response to those opinions does. And second, that admitting our mistakes and seeking to make amends is one of the most courageous things we can do. After the service, several of Morrison's former players approached Tom. Many of them shared similar stories. Harsh words that had crushed their spirits, dreams abandoned because they believed they weren't good enough. That's when Tom realized the full impact of that day on the field. He hadn't been the only one. Morrison's words had shaped dozens of lives, most of them in ways that limited rather than liberated. Tom established the Morrison Foundation that summer, dedicated to training youth coaches in positive reinforcement techniques. The foundation's motto, inspired by Morrison's final words, was simple: "Be better than yesterday." The irony wasn't lost on Tom that his greatest critic had become his greatest teacher. Not through harsh words, but through humble recognition of their impact. Morrison's legacy lived on not in the dreams he crushed, but in the commitment to ensure other coaches would build dreams instead. Years later, when young athletes asked Tom about handling criticism and doubt, he would tell them about Coach Morrison, not to villainize the man, but to illustrate a powerful truth. Sometimes our greatest challenges become our greatest strengths, and sometimes our harshest critics become our most important teachers. The words that were meant to end Tom Brady's football dreams became the foundation of his legendary career. But more importantly, they led to a conversation about forgiveness, redemption, and the power we all have to transform our mistakes into lessons that help others. Coach Morrison was right about one thing. Tom Brady did waste everyone's time that day on the field. He wasted time believing that other people's limitations applied to him. But that waste of time became the most valuable lesson of his life. In the end, the boy who was told he'd never be good enough became the man who taught the world that being good enough was never enough. And the coach who broke a child's heart learned that healing begins with acknowledging the harm we've caused and dedicating ourselves to doing better. Some words cut deep enough to change everything. Coach Morrison's words changed Tom Brady's life. And eventually, Tom Brady's response changed Morrison's heart. In the end, they both learned that our greatest failures often become our most important victories. Not in spite of the pain they cause, but because of what we choose to do with that pain. The field where it all began still hosts youth football games every Saturday. On the wall of the equipment shed, there's a plaque that reads, "Your past doesn't determine your future, and other people's limitations don't apply to you." Tom Brady, class of 1992. Right below it, in smaller letters, are Coach Morrison's final words. "Tell the kids to be better than I was." Sometimes the best coaching happens not in the moment of triumph, but in the quiet acknowledgement of our failures and the commitment to help others succeed where we fell short. Coach Morrison's harshest lesson became his greatest gift, not because of what he said, but because of what Tom Brady chose to do with those words. And in youth football complexes across the country, coaches now teach their players that criticism is just someone else's opinion, and opinions are just starting points for proving what's possible when we refuse to accept other people's limitations as our own. The boy who was told he'd fail became the man who taught the world that failure is just another word for not finished yet. And the coach who crushed a dream learned that redemption is always possible, even if it comes in the final minutes of the game.